All right, here we go. Adler, Fanon and Adler. More than Freud and Jung, Adler comes closest to Fanon's psychological perspective. Adler was an adherent socialist in his youth and continued to take a passionate interest in the social problems of his day. In contrast to both Freud and Jung, Adler had grown up amidst the working class population, with whom he maintained a degree of emotional attachment. His earliest work, Health Book for the Tailor Trade, reflects the degree of Adler's class consciousness. More particularly, it established him as a pioneer in the field of social medicine, public health. In consequent works, Adler emphasized the social origins of neurosis and elaborated the importance of a familial, we're going to look at that word, particularly the sibling constellation for the personality development. So I think it's familial. I can't say the word. We're going to look at that word real quick. Go away. Go away. What are you doing? Why is it doing things I don't want it to do? There we go. K-F-A-M-I-L-I-A-L. So, familial. Anything relating to suggestive of or characteristics of a family. There we go. All right. Education, social praxis, and creativity occupy a more central position in Adler's individual psychology than either Freud's psychoanalysis or Jung's analytical psychology. Let me get rid of something in my eyes. There it goes. So much hair. Sorry, everybody. Fanon readily adopted Adler's concept of inferiority, superiority, and dominance, compensation, lifestyle, and social interest. He was in fact using an Adlerian formulation when he, Fanon, remarked that, quote, the white man behaves towards black people as an older brother reacts to the birth of a younger, end quote. Fanon made a number of references to Adler's understanding human nature and the nervous character. The chapter, quote, the feeling of inferiority and the striving for recognition. In Adler's understanding, human nature seems to have had a particular impact on Fanon. Summarized in this chapter were one of Adler's central concepts: organ inferiority, subjective inferiority, compensation, striving for superiority, lifestyle, social feelings, and sibling constellation. Fanon adaptly used some of these concepts to unveil the psychopathologies endemic in the colonial situation. In contrast to Freudian or Jungian theories, the Adlerian influenced on him were more pervasive in his original work and less discordant with his ideological persuasion. In Black Skins, White Masks, Fanon in fact devoted the whole section to black people and Adler. Fanon stated here that he called, quote, the first truth, black people is a comparison who is constantly preoccupied with self-evaluation and self-validation. They use the N-word with the O for black, so I'm not going to say it. The Antilles have no inherent value of their own. They are always contingent on the presence of the other. The question is always whether he is less intelligent than I, less respectable than I. Every position of one's own, every effort at security is based on relations of independence with the diminution of the other. It is a wreckage of what surrounds me and provides the foundations of my virality. Underlining this preoccupation with comparisons, this obsession with self-validation, and is a diffused aggression a wish to dominate, a striving for superiority, more fundamentally, an inferiority complex to which the rest are only compensatory reactions. The black man is obsessed with his manhood because the oppressor emasculated him. But since the black man is yet unable to liberate himself from the arsenal of internalized complexes, his compatriots or individuals less fortunate than he become easy prey for his reactive aggression and false sense of superiority. This Adlerlenian leech is of course historical in origins. Fanon, this is what Fanon says: if we are strict in applying the conclusions of the Adlerian school, we should say that the black person is seeking to protest against the inferiority he feels historically, since in all periods black people has been an inferior. He attempts to react with a superiority complex. By self-analysis and observation, Fanon discerns the overt and subtle manifestations of the Adlerian dynamics in such diverse contexts as language, acquisition, sex, marriage, family, and family constellation, children rearing practices, and intellectual endeavors. It was indeed a central theme of his first book that neither, quote, authenticate love nor creative self-actualization to attainable until, quote, one has purged oneself of that feeling of inferiority or that Adlerian exaltation, that overcompensation, which seems to be the indice of the black person. In subsequent chapters, we will demonstrate Fanon's remarkable use of the inferiority complex and his views on how best to purge oneself of a debilitating complexes. Yet, in spite of having assimilated these Adlerian influences, Fanon's critical and creative mind could never allow him to embrace any formulation conceived under other skies and for a different population. Here again, as in many other instances, Fanon needed to reformulate and reinterpret Freud's psychoanalytical theorizing was found wanting mainly because of the unwarranted generalization of the Oedipus complex. Jung was debunked when he resorted to the Lemurican theory of evolution to explain the collective unconsciousness. Adler, too, was criticized for his limited and somewhat incidental emphasis on psychopathogenic factors in the development of neurosis, a character disorder. For in his central theory of organ inferiority, as in his conception of social conflict, Adler was deeply entrenched in the tradition of the medical model and the social Darwinism of his day. Fanon was particularly critical of his teleological and ontogenetic explanation. In effect, Adler has created a psychology of the individual. We have just seen that the feeling of inferiority and the Antillian characteristic. It is not just this or that Antillian or who embodies the neurotic formulation, but all Antillians. Antillian society is a neurotic society, a society of comparison, quote unquote. Hence, we are driven from the individual back to the social structures. If there is a taint, it lies in not the soul of the individual, but rather in that of the environment. So Fanon's taking a materialist outlook, seeing how things interact with each other and how they create these situations and these conditions for people. When Adler paid sufficient attention to social genetic factors, his theorizing did not extend fundamentally beyond the parameters of family dynamics and sibling constellation. What he conceded ideologically, but failed to accomplish in fact, was the grounding of his theories in his social, historical, and cultural foundations, in which the family itself is a mediator and a microcosm. Fanon was dissatisfied with Adler's delimitation of the environment. It is, of course, true that Adler attempted to rehabilitate the previous fragmented and reified psyche with an unitary and holistic psychology. But the development of a genuine social genetic psychology eluded him. Social reality remained for him an encounter between separate and distinct egos, interacting with the dominant each other within the limited space, time coordinates of the family. This narrow and personalistic overemphasis of Adler was indeed incompatible with Fanon's repeated observation. The black man feels inferior historically, not because of an organic defect or a simple familial dysfunction. Hence Fanon's personal disassociation from Adler's psychology. I have the fact that all the facts that I have noted are real, but it should not be necessary to point out. They have only a superficial connection with Adler's psychology, and the Martinican does not compare himself with the white man qua father, leader, God. He compares himself with his fellows against the cultural pattern of the white man. The Adlerian comparison embraces two terms. It is polarized by the ego. The Antillean comparison is surmounted by a third term. Its governing fiction is not personal, but social. In short, so Fanon's taking everything, the whole picture, seeing the trees within the forest, seeing the forest itself, and in short, Fanon sought to unravel the debilitating consequences of economic and cultural domination. For Freud, Jung, and Adler, such an analysis was both inaccessible and irrelevant from their personal, class, culture, and racial standpoint. Bourgeois psychologists of an unquestionable high caliber, they study the particular type of psyche from affluent and central heights during the heyday of colonialism. Their patients emerged from their relatively stable social culture framework that had not been shaken by the violent ruptures of colonialism. Individual differences in health and pathology seem to them most conspicuous, and an explanation of them most pressing in their clinical work with bourgeois patients whose economic and cultural realities were intact. They subsequently postulate a type of human reality, namely bourgeois psychological reality, as the conditions of men everywhere. So they utilize the bourgeoisie as a universal person. Wow. Conformity or deviation from this bourgeois reality thus became the absolute criterion for health and pathology. Fanon's roots were in contrast in a vastly different historical context. In personal temperament and social origins, he had a special advantage of experiencing and grasping the meaning of oppression from the perspective of a colonial victim. For him, sociogeny took a definite precedent over both ontogeny and phylogeny. The fragmenting effects of ontogenetics perspective and on the ossifying consequences of phylogenics explanation obscured a fundamental dimension of the human psyche. Because of their conservative thrust, both ontogeny and phylogeny negate man's vocation as the subject of history, and thus dash any hopes of social change. Ontogeny reveals man the individual, the helpless, hopeless, and isolated object of a repressive and overpowering social structure. Phylogeny points to the fertility of man's resistance against a curse that is embedded in an irretrievable past. This consistently argued throughout his writings. It was Fanon's unwavering conviction that the fundamental cause of alienation is first socioeconomic and second the internalization of societal inequity, and as well as violence. To be effective and meaningful, according to Fanon, all efforts towards disalienation must therefore intervene both at the socioeconomic and the psychological level. This sociogenetic perspective prompted Fanon to guard against the abstract postulation of categorical classification of human reality and describes its psychic modalities only through deviation from it. A psychology founded in the social dialectic was for him the only reliable basis to, quote, strive unremittingly for a concrete and new understanding of man. As we show in subsequent chapters, this shift from ontogeny to sociogeny is indeed a precondition for a Fanonian radical psychology and therapy appropriate to the wretched of the earth. Chapter 5. Any questions? No questions. Okay. So now we got the picture, and let's look up a couple things. Let's look up let's see if I can find the words. I want to look them up. I was going to look them up. I was just going to wait. La 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 la. Let me look for them. Sorry, everybody. Where's that social genie? Oh, so I gotta find it. Sorry, everybody. I'm looking for this real quick. No, 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 no. Just looking for the word. I cannot find it. There it is. Social genie. Let's look that up real quick. I'm probably not saying it right either, but we'll find out. It's SOCIOGENY. Yeah, it won't let me say it. Social genie is the development of social phenomenon, structures, and cultural norms. That to me makes more sense than the other. Let's find out what the phylogeny is. Phylogeny. I don't know how to say it. PHYLO. Oh my gosh, it H. PHYLO. God. Keeps messing me up. Oh, God dang it. Come on. What are we doing? The phone is not helping me. No. Oh my gosh. PHY. Finally. There it is. Am I going to say it?
Phylogeny.
Wait.
Phylogeny.
Phenology. I can't say it. The evolutionary history and genetic relationships among a group of organisms and species. There we go. Now that we got those two out of the way. All right, chapter 5, colonial research and medicine. Science depoliticizes. Science is in the service of man. It is often non-existent in the colonies. Fanon, Dying Colonialism. Very good book. Dying Colonialism, very good book. Hey, what's up, Oaken? Colonialism and racism are two integral and coordinated assaults on people of color. The violence that gives them birth and sustains them inevitably reverberates in all spheres of social existence. In the colonial as in the racist societies, no human activity remains untarnished. The ambience of violence is everywhere. Even the search for knowledge and the honored practice of healing becomes easily perverted into instruments of greed, social control, and dehumanization. A review of Euro-American research and medical practice demonstrates that colonialism is not merely a product of petty officials, and that racism is not simply an emotional quirk or arrogant layman. Contrary to common claims, racism finds its origins and support among the best representatives of Euro-America. Even the tools used by Western scholars and physicians serve as a veritable arsenal for human subjugation and exploitation. This chapter examines how, you gotta listen to this, here we go. This chapter examines two critical human endeavors, namely, the conduct of research and the practice of healing in the context of oppression. Firstly, it examines the kind of questions about people of color that for decades preoccupied Euro-American researchers and physicians. Secondly, the chapter highlights the role of medicine in conquest. We will see that not only did physicians work closely with colonial administrators, but that they also provided a new impetus to oppression, where men of arms. Finally, the chapter explains Fanon's seminal contribution to his critiques of such research and medical practices. It should become clear from this that Fanon insights suggest that Western scholarship and the Western practice of medicine be critically reevaluated. Racism in research. Here we go. Next chapter. Next section. Sorry. As early as the 1700s, a debate was raging among Victorian scientists regarding the educatable. Ooh. Let me find out this word real quick, everybody. I wish I could pronounce better. Maybe one day I will. Capability. I don't know. Oop. That's it. It won't let me do it. Oh my gosh, come on. You're not gonna let me pronounce it? What the fuck? Educability. It's educability. Quality and state of being educable. Educability of the African. In 1977, the Briton Charles White agreed with the conclusion of von Sommermering of Germany that the African was lacking in intelligence, and this affected the outcome of the debate just preceding the 1907 Anti-Slave Trade Act. In spite of the evidence on the contrary, the White's conclusion struck a responsive chord, since this provided a, quote, scientific rationalization of slavery. Samuel Morton, American physician and a professor of anatomy, had also established a transatlantic reputation for his conclusion that the black man was intellectually inferior to the Caucasian. What is more, with the publication of Darwin's The Origin of Species and the economic motives of regarding the African as subhuman, it required little originality from President Hunt of the Anthropological Society of London to assert that the black man, quote, descended from the ape only a few generations ago, end quote. Such degeneration of black people in the name of science was by no means confined to British and American intellectual circles. In 1860, for instance, the Frenchman Paul Broca reported that the brain of the African weighed 78.5 grams less than that of the European. That at about the same time, the more influential D. Gobenian propounded a doctrine that the, quote, different races of humankind are innately unequal in talent, worth, and ability to absorb and create culture, end quote. He argued further that it was absurd to maintain an equality of races in any sphere of social existence. In his the Gobenian, laid the foundation for the supremacists' Nordic school. He argued there that, quote, the various branches of human family are distinguished by permanent and erratic. Oh my gosh, I don't know that word either. I knew this book was gonna challenge me, and it's great. I like it. Eradicable. I think it's eradicable. And it won't let me say it. Jesus Christ, come on. I think it's ineradicable. And that means something impossible to uproot, destroy, or completely remove. Ineradicable differences, both mentally and physically. And the black race are the lowest on the scale. Ew. Thus, according to I can't say his name, Gobinian, people of color are not only unintelligent, they are also innately incapable of creating the rudiments of culture. These earlier claims of inequality, oh my gosh, I can't talk today. Inequality, huh?
Inequality.
Yeah,
I was trying to figure
inequality.
out what you're saying.
Yeah, inequality among the races indeed found their absurd extremes in the work of men like Carroll, who set out to compel, quote, evidence that black people is not of the human family, end quote. In a work published in 1902, Carroll went so far as to assert that, quote, all the evidence indicates that the best of the field which tempted Eve was a black person who served Eve in the capacity of a maid servant. Jesus Christ. Innate inferiority, inherited criminality, and domestic servitude were thus suggested to be the primordial nature of the black race. Ew. The master-slave relationship between whites and black people was not viewed as a phenomenon of a given historical epoch, but rather as a fact of nature. These early rationalization of slavery have had a lasting effects on the later psychological research in Africa. The pseudoscience that justified slavery later was used to rationalize colonialism in Africa. In the 1920s, Lucien Levy Bruhl took upon himself the task of, quote, enlightening his readers on the thought process of the African. Levy Bruhl propounded a concreteness thesis on the classification of a pre-logical mentality to describe the African mode of thought. It was accordingly surmised that the African, unlike the European, had yet to develop the capacity for logical and abstract thinking. Jesus Christ. And the African was said to rely merely on memory and lack of the capacity for individuation. individuation. Of course. It is a lifelong psychological process of developing a unique, authentic identity. Of course, it's not going to let me say the damn word. Oh, come on. Why do we do this? I have to listen to a commercial. Individuation. A belief. Individuation. Oh my God. Sorry, everybody. I just lost where I'm at. I'm having a hard time today. Where did it go?
The word individuation.
Yeah, there it is. A belief in mystical causation and the failure to learn from experience were also seen to be distinguishing characteristics. Assuming that the development of thought process was genetically determined, Levy Bruhl concluded that the African mode of thought had to belong to the earlier phylogenetic stage. Despite some definite but indecisive opposition, Levy Bruhl's view significantly influenced Euro-American psychologists for decades. This view of Euro-American psychologists fosters by a particular social and material relationship, which readily used in the service of colonialism. It therefore comes as no surprise that Dougal, for one, wrote, "The theory of Levy Bruhl's is supported by a mass of data and reasoned with great persuasion. As such, it deserves the closest study, not only because it accounts for many facts of African thought and behavior, but also because it would, quote, it would have far-reaching consequences in the framing of practical policies and modes of dealing with the African. Jesus Christ. The most instant, however, colonial ruler did not wait until their academians derived from theory, quote, practical policies and modes of dealing with the African, end quote. Colonial armies and administrators had long ensured the ruthless exploitation and forced subjugation of the African. What was needed instead was the institutionalization, rationalization to stifle the consciousness and conscience of its own agents, are real or potential. A scientific basis for rationalization could only further fortify colonialism. Now, it is not sufficient to attribute to the African a, quote, pre-logical mentality, end quote. The African had to be characterized as, in subhuman terms, as a freak of nature, or at least as a subnormal human being whose infantile proclivities and dependencies needs all for the exercise of internal authority or the presence of a parent surrogate, the white people, of course. Thus, Ritchie argued for the existence of two forces in African psychology. He suggested the presence of the benevolent force giving him everything for nothing, and the malevolent force depriving him of life itself. The subsequent ambivalence and conflict are said to make the African dependent on a mother or a mother surrogate. Furthermore, it is argued that the individual personality of the African, quote, is never liberated and brought under conscious rational control, end quote. The implication here is an Mononan's analysis, discussed later, is that the African looks upon the European colonizer as a parent, surrogate, who protects him and meets his innate dependency needs. Similar contentions of low intelligence, dependency needs, and lack of individuation occurred in later psychological research on the African. For instance, Howard and Rowland compared the scores of Nigerian and European subjects on the good enough draw a man test. That's what they said. Their interpretation of the scores included suggestions of a low-level personal individuation, an inability to abstract or synthesize, a failure of developing a self-image or body boundary, and thus, quote, the existence of certain psychological mechanisms or frames of thought, which he, quote, he, the African, appears to share with the white mental patient. Howard and Rowlands, they concluded also that the African finds pleasure in routine activities, and that, quote, this love of repetition is doubtless but another manifestation of a rigid, concrete attitude of the native. What is more, they argued that, quote, his concreteness and meditation, meditation. Hold on, I gotta look at this word. They using big words, everybody. I don't care. Hopefully they'll let me say it this time, right? There it is.
Mentation.
Mentation. Mentation refers to a mental activity, thinking, and the overall state of a person's cognitive and emotional process.
Mentation.
Mentation does not admit of compromise, only imitation, for it has long been established that black race are natural mimics. Ugh. One implication of this alleged concreteness is, of course, this, quote, when introducing him to Western work routine, one finds it convenient to adopt an approach suited to the European child of 10. So this is telling you why, like, it's bad to call black people either like child names, because this science proves that, like, they try to use this science and they're saying that black people or people of color are the children of the world. And they're saying that they just barely hit like human civilization through the white person. So that's why it's bad to tell a black man to call him a boy. That's horrible, because we looked at them as childlike, and we still do in essence. We still do as white people. More recently, Perrin and Morgan Gnethler, I don't know how to say these people's names, used psychoanalytic concepts in a study of character formations among Africans. They concluded that the Africans lack a super ego, operates solely on the pleasure and principles, has no work ethic, and is incapable of guilt, and responds only to, quote, command from the external authority, imitations of and identification with, and a prestige barrier, reward and punishment, end quote. And in an effort to support these contentions, Perrin and, I can't say this person's name, Morgethler, cited that in their view represented typical cases. One of these concerns a European missionary and an ordinary African, quote, the white father. That's what they said that we are as white people, and said to have implored the African to work on a particular task as a favor. When the African refused, the missionary immediately resorted to firm command. The African is said to quickly resume the task with this retort, quote, you should not have asked me whether I mind it. You should have told me straight away that I have to do it, end quote. Another illustration is said to be that of the African road builders who explained to their European foremen why they failed to execute a given task. Quote, neither you nor our deputy were watching us. As long as one of you is there, we will work quite willingly, end quote. Thus here again, as in so many other works, external authority and ruthless control are being justified in the name of science. Yeah, that's why it's called pseudoscience. When by 1960s, many African countries gained their independence, Euro-American research in Africa changed in tone and language. This shift was in form, not in function. Reports came to be couched less blatantly, with fewer racist terms. Yet one function of research remained that the social control and rationalization of the oppressive status quo, as I have shown elsewhere. Neocolonialism and apartheid advanced numerously pseudoscientific psychological theories for the social control of exploitation of African labor. And that's the end of that section. Any questions? Because we're going to racism and medicine. Any questions? Doesn't look like it. All right, racism and medicine. That racism is in the era of slavery continued into the epoch of colonialism is borne out not only by the assertion of psychologists, but also by the pronouncement of Euro-American physicians, as psychologists and anthropologists persisted in the contention that the African is innately unintelligent and genetically inferior. Their counterparts in medicine were busy compiling all sorts of scientific evidence, quote unquote, to support these and even more pessimistic conclusions. These affirmations and conclusions had particular weight because physicians had by the 19th century emerged as sole arbiters of debates on the anatomical and psychological differences among racial groups. And what obsessed Euro-American physicians about black people and the instruments they elaborated illustrated the substance and method of a truly shameful aspect of medical science. This is hardly an aspect of black anatomy, or physiology that has not been scrutinized by Euro-American physicians. They observed and measured the sexual organs of black people. They determined skull size and shape. This is phrenology, I think. They compared brain weights and even brain convolutions with those of other races. They sought to infer human destiny from hair texture and hair color. They recorded differences in skin color and examined melanoctites. What's that word? I tried. I think it's I don't know how the acolytes. Maybe it's acolytes. We'll find out. Hopefully, if it lets me do it. So MELANOCYTES. A specialized cell in the body, epidermis, eyes, and hair follicles that produce melanin. Okay. They predicted the longevity of black people and concluded that black survival is untenable, and have asserted that black people were a menace to the Caucasian race. They set out to map the schedule and pattern of black extinction. In short, the assault on black people has been total, as physicians coordinated their activities with Euro-American men of arms, political administrators, and scholars in the human sciences. Physicians have long endeavored to provide scientific justification for slavery, colonial rule, and racial segregation. And we still uphold it today in our medical systems now. One widely held belief of 19th century physicians was that the emancipation of black people in America would bring about their total extinction. Joseph Camp Kennedy, a noted statistician and superintendent of the eighth census, remarked in 1862 that the actual extinction of the black race was an, quote, unerring certainty, end quote. He argued that freedom for and gradual assimilation of black people would only hasten the process of extinction. Physicians subsequently compiled various types of data to confirm this. The 9th and the 10th census of 1870 to 1888, research by the United States Army, statistically data from insurance companies, numerous reports from physicians. All of these were used to coordinate the inevitable end of the black race. Having embraced Kennedy's prediction, physicians then set out to determine the cause of this impending extinction. These causes are indeed as interesting as the prediction itself. E.T. Easley, an important Texan physician, argued in 1875 that emancipation was a major cause of the deterioration of the black race. He considered the emancipation of black people as, quote, the most deplorable even in the history of that race, end quote. The further suggestion that freedom brought black people social status for which they were innately ill-equipped. According to Easley, the white slave owners who best knew how to be a nurturing caretaker of black slaves was now saddled with the responsibility of being the undertaker of free black people. Eugene R. Corson, writing in a prestigious New York Medical Times in 1888, agreed with Easley's conclusion. He added that black people were more prolific, but died off much faster than whites. This pattern, Corson argued, follows the biological principles that simple organisms have greater, quote, potential pro-lifeness, but they lack the ability for more complex organisms for individual survival. That physician, like Easley and Corson, were inspired by the works of Malthus, Darwin, and Spencer, is not surprising. Edward B. Bullock of Howard University, meanwhile, proposed several anthropometric generalities about black people. He suggests that black people have a lessened sensibility, end quote, and their nervous system, which made them more able to endure surgery. Goddamn. Physicians of the U.S. Army performed extensive post-mortem examinations of black soldiers during the Civil War in order to find suspected anomalies in black anatomy and brain weight. Jesus Christ. On the basis of Army investigation, W.J. Burt concluded that black people have, quote, little elasticity and temperament, end quote, and lack of, quote, nervous endurance and moral courage, end quote. He also added that contrary to Bullock's black show, a, quote, fearful mortality, end quote, in all surgical operations, and thus the ordinary practice of medicine is inappropriate for black people. Jesus Christ. If the prediction of inevitable extinction was intended to decry freedom from black people, the view that ordinary medical practice was inappropriate for black people effectively prevented the chance for black people benefiting from the advances in medicine. More fundamentally, the prediction of extinction and the contention of medical irrelevance had in effect regulated black people to a subhuman status and tantalized the genocidal wishful thinking of the racist. Both the prediction and contention also accentuates, I can't say the dang word. It's ASSUAGED. It's my voice. I mean, not my voice. I think it's my, like, tongue. I gotta figure out how I can, like, pronounce things better. Assuaged. Okay. Assuage the consciousness of those who otherwise would have been alarmed by the high disease and mortality rates among oppressed black people. As Chase, 1977, clearly shows, the prediction of imminent distinction is today replaced by the fear of a high black birth rate in America. Hence the crude and subtle programs of today to sterilize black people, black underclasses. Yet the current effort at sterilization is but a feature of an old morbid obsession with the sexual organs of black people. Since the 19th century, Euro-American physicians had made scrupulous remarks about black sexuality. Claims were frequently made that the sexual organs of black people were a, quote, massive proportions, end quote. Black males were all too often depicted to have an uncontrollable, quote, stallion-like passion, end quote, and were viewed as, quote, a menace to the Caucasian race, end quote. Much was also made of the presumed relationship between sexual precocity. Oh my gosh, I don't know this word either. This is all in America. Yeah, this is this horrible shit. Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Fatima, I don't know if we're going to get anything. I think everybody gave as much as they could. Precocity. Is it precocity? Maybe it's precocity. Precocity is Precocity. Refers to the state of developing certain abilities, intelligence, and maturity much earlier than the typical for one's age. Okay. Between the sexual precocity of the mental arrest of black people were said to exhibit sexual passions at an earlier age, and was also argued that mental atrophy at the later age made them slaves to sexual impulses. The concern that black males were a menace to the Caucasian race was heightened by rape of white women by black men. Oof. The more frequent rape of black women by white men was never a cause of similar alarms or serious research. Let's say that again. The more frequent rape of black women by white men was never a cause of similar alarm or serious research. The association often made between the emancipation of sexual bestiality of black people is indeed interesting. But more remarkable are the kind of solutions physicians proposed to encounter the Black menace. Many physicians argued against the education, assimilation, and migration of Black people. William Lee Howard, a Baltimore physician, maintained in 1903 that education will be neither, quote, reduce the large size of the black penis, end quote, or, quote, prevent the African's birthright to sexual wildness and excess. Dr. Charles S. Bacon of Chicago argued that education for Black people is a, quote, out of place as a piano in the, oh my gosh, the Hottentots tent, and that Black people are, quote, just as devoid of ethical sentiment or consciousness as a fly or a maggot. Oh my gosh, end quote. They're making me do the hard reading today, I guess. What is more miscongention? I don't know how to say this word. It's what I get for reading like I don't know what you call these academic works. CEGENATION. There we go.
Miscegenation.
Miscegenation, which means the married cohabitation or sexual relations between individuals of different races and ethnic groups.
Miscegenation.
Miscegenation as a solution to the, quote, Black problem, end quote. I just said a few, okay. Was seen as more adherent by Euro-American physicians than were efforts to educate and culturally assimilate Black people. In interracial marriages and education of Black people were unacceptable to these physicians. One would suppose that these scholars would welcome suggestions of forced reparations of the people who they considered a menace to the Caucasian race. The truth was indeed the contrary. Physicians were well aware of the place of Black people in the economy, and they strongly opposed such forced migration. Dr. Charles S. Bacon indeed argued that Black workers form, quote, the two valuable and economic factors to be eliminated, end quote. What he suggests instead were tactics to prevent the political and social organization of Black people. The solution he and others suggest to combat the, quote, Black menace, end quote, was selective castration. For instance, Professor Leidston at Chicago College of Physicians once proposed that castration would make Black people docile, quiet, and inoffensive, end quote. He added that the castration of some Black men, quote, would be a constant warning, an ever-present admonition to others in the race. Of course, such blatant propositions were consistent with the prevailing wisdom in those days, like lynching of Black males was a common American ritual. Yet none of these racist assertions are as shocking and scandalous as recently halted Tuskegee experiment on syphilis among Black people in Macon County, Alabama. Jones, 1981. The study was conducted by U.S. Public Health Service in collaboration with various states of federal health agency. Syphilis is, of course, a serious and contagious disease, which, if untreated in time, attacks many vital organs, including the central nervous system and the, cardiovascular system. Got it, finally. The project involves a following up study of 400 Black males and their families. For 40 years, these victims of syphilis and their families have been duped into cooperating in this research. In order to study the effects of untreated syphilis, they were never informed that they had syphilis, and they were never informed that they had syphilis and were not treated. Jesus Christ. The study, and there's another book, if everybody's interested, there's another book. It's called American Medical Apartheid. Talks about these things too in more depth. It's more of a It's more of a like a textbook. But if you're in our server, you can get it. Medical apartheid. The study started in 1932 and ended as recently as 1972. The ostensible aim of the study was to study the effects of untreated syphilis. More fundamentally, however, the assumption. Fundamentally, however, the assumption and thrust of this study derived from the racist obsession of American physicians with black sexuality. Reading about such projects, one is reminded of Aimé César's assertion that we have been lied to. Schmittler is not dead, quote unquote. What is actually most frightening is that the syphilis study could have been undertaken so recently that physicians under the Hippocratic Oath could engage in such ruthless practices. The fact remains, however, that Euro-American physicians have all along been among the staunchest supporters of racism and colonialism. Certain of them have, of course, been vocal in the plight of black people and active in social reforms, but the elitist character of their training and practice was tended to insulate most Euro-American physicians from the mysteries of black people and the oppressed. Those who came into contact with the poor and the dispossessed tended to blame the victim. It would take us far beyond the objective of this chapter to detail the racism of Euro-American scholars and physicians. The preceding illustrations taken from various eras underscore the fact that Euro-American research and medicine have served as instruments of domination. The more detailed exposition would show that the charge of genetic inferiority regarding the poor generally and people of color particularly has reappeared in temporal clusters associated with periods of heightened social crisis and change. An earlier cluster followed the discovery and effective settlement of the Americas, exemplified by the debate between Bartholomew de la Casse and Gins de Sepúlveda. There are two people. This charge was based on the debate of whether Native Americans, indigenous people, should be enslaved. A second cluster emerged during the French Revolution. Gobineau and his cohorts asserted that superiority of the aristocracy and the Aryan race. The third cluster occurred during the Industrial Revolution. Malthus, Galton, and Spencer argued for the biological elimination of the poor and people of color. Just prior to the American Civil War, we discerned a fourth cluster of racism in scholarship. This racism was heralded by pro-slavery forces. Fifth and sixth and seventh clusters emerged consecutively during the colonial scramble in Africa, the rising wave of immigration during the early 1900s, and the Supreme Court decisions of 1954 that made segregation illegal. The seventh cluster coincided with the struggle of independence in Africa. The latest resurgence of academic racism followed President Johnson, quote, the Great Society, end quote, program. This was heralded by Jensen's well-publicized diatribe on the IQ of black people. Recent reactions to affirmative action and busing for purposes of school desegregation have obviously given impetus to scientific racism under the rubric of, quote, social biology. Wilson, 1978. Medicine and Conquest. Any questions before I move on? We're going to Medicine and Conquest. All right, no questions. All right. Disease, of course, Medicine and Conquest. Disease, of course, occurs in all societies. Communities all over the world summon healers in times of personal distress and physical affliction. The universal desire for physical and mental well-being permits healers to wield unusual power and influence in every society. Such power and influence emanate not only from the unique functions of healers, but also such power and influence are to some extent necessary for the process of healing itself. But, wait, what? Oh. Yeah. But to limit the misuse of a healer's power and influence, ethical codes govern the practice of healing of all societies. The Hippocratic Oath is the best known. The judicious use the healer's power and influence are therefore considered sacrosanct. It can happen, however, that healers employ their power and skills in the service of social oppression and greed. The introduction of the Western medicine in Africa illustrates this. Historically, colonial subjugation has followed the well-known pattern. First to come are colonial soldiers or missionaries. The soldiers pacified the population by dint of superior arms. The missionaries, armed with the Bible, infiltrate remote villages to self-righteously save heathens, quote unquote, from hellfire. The soldiers and missionaries, whoever came first, destabilized the native society, and others simply mopped up following the devastation. The brawn and resolve of the colonized pacified, and regard personal and of colonialism were then promptly deployed. Physicians and teachers soon arrived to complete the process of subjugation. The colonized were in the end broken physically and spiritually. The physician was often a missionary or an army doctor. It would be tedious to recount the legends, like those of Dr. Livingston, that dewy-eyed apologists of colonialism have widely propagated. But what is little appreciated is the historical roles of European physicians played on the colonial conquest, covert diplomacy, espionage, and social exploitation. When Europe unleashed its violence and defenseless Africans, malaria initially impeded colonial conquest. From the 15th to the middle of the 19th centuries, attempts to establish colonies in Africa were effectively thwarted by the Europeans' lower immunity to malaria and yellow fever. In the 15th century, the Portuguese consistently failed, with enormous losses of life, to establish colonies in West Africa. The English, French, Dutch, and Danish were later to suffer similar setbacks due to the African fever, quote unquote. For instance, febrile and diarrhea. Is that right? The diarrheal diseases disseminated the British colonies established at Freetown in 1789 and later in 1692. How's it later? Major British expeditions to West Africa in 1832 to 1934 and again 1841 to 1942 were effectively halted by African fever. Missionary societies also lost more than one half of their personnel in their first year in Africa. If Africans could not match the superior arms of the epidemic diseases to which they were generally more resistant, frustrated the Europeans. When men of arms failed to achieve imperialistic goals, European physicians rose to the occasion. Their contributions to colonial conquest thus won them a special place in the history of oppression. Their work on tropical diseases also gave new impetus to the development of Western medicine. This is best illustrated by the history and the treatment of prevention of malaria. The causative organism was microscopically identified in 1880, and the mode of transmission of the disease was demonstrated in 1898. Yet the treatment for the regimen to prevent malaria were developed in Britain by 1850. The practical exigencies of the colonial scramble in Africa led to advances in treatment and prevention before the disease was understood scientifically. Prior to this, European physicians believed that malaria was caused by bright sunlight, light dew, exertion, excitation, damp environments, bloodletting, and miracles. Oh, wait, I don't know this word. Bloodletting. Let's find out what this word means. MERCURIAL.
Mercurial.
Mercurials. which is someone whose moods or behavior change quickly and unpredictably. So,
Mercurial.
mercurials were common treatments. Later, as contact with other continents increased, oh my gosh, oh man, this has got to be arsenic and wine were used. Okay, so this is something bark. Let's find out what it is. CENCHO. Got it. Of course. Oh, there it is.
Cinchona.
Cinchona bark, arsenic, and wine were used. British Navy physicians working on the African coast first demonstrated the quinine was more effectively than either bloodletting or, hold on.
Cinchona.
Oh no, that's not it. Where was it at? Oh my gosh, I lost it. Okay, hold on. I lost it. Oh, it's mercurials. Oh, mercurials. I can't say the damn word. I tried. MERCURIAL.
Mercurial.
Mercurials, which is someone whose mood or behavior changes quickly. Oh, yeah, I already did that one. T.R.H. Thompson, in particular, himself a physician in the 1841 expedition, established the appropriate dose of quinine for the prevention of malaria. Meanwhile, the analysis of the treatment and mortality of British naval officers in Africa and Asia allowed the naval surgeon, Alexander Bryson, to develop an effective program of prophylaxis. Don't know what this one is either. PROPHYL.
Prophylaxis.
Prophylaxis. A major test in his quinine regiment came when the British government learned that the Niger and Benue rivers were navigable and thus could serve as a commercial inland waterway. To ensure that the crew took their medication, Bryson recommended that quinine be mixed with the regular supply of wine, providing the participants in a expedition. Not a single person died of malaria during the entire expedition. There were only a few cases of illness, and these were mild. European physicians thus removed the last barrier of colonial conquest and opened up a new era in which Western medicine, the most developed science of healing, contributed to human oppression and dehumanization. During and after colonial scramble, some European physicians served as spies and propagandists for their governments. For instance, the French conquest of Morocco could not have been realized without the infiltration and skillful machinations of French physicians. When other attempts at conquest failed, French physicians were dispatched to use their medical skills to win the favors of the Sultan, to pass along intelligence, and to sow social discourse. Most notable is in this regard is Dr. Reynaud Liniers, an agent of the French Foreign Service. From the 1870s to 1900, he was the key French diplomat at the Moroccan court. A French higher official once described him as a precarious liaison, capable of neutralizing rival influences and preparing the way for peaceful penetration of Morocco. Following the conquest, the colonial physician played a significant role in the dislocation of the indigenous culture and disruption of traditional healing and the erosion of social cohesion. That's the end of that one. Any questions? Does anybody have any questions? Doesn't look like it. All right, here we go. Fanon's critique of the literature of the scientific racism was not extensive. It was nonetheless incisive and illustrates the limitations of research in the colonial situation. Fanon argued that previous critiques of scientific racism was scanty and half-hearted. He felt, for instance, that Sir Alan Burt's book color prejudice, color prejudice, at the time considered to espouse a highly liberal outlook, was only a partial and timid rejection of the racist formulation of such men as Gabin, Gordon, and Carothers. I can't say their names. Fanon paid particular attention to the works of H. L. Gordon and J.C. Carothers, psychiatrist. Gordon and Carothers, can't say their name, established themselves as authorities on African psychology. Gordon was a British physician at a Marathon mental hospital in Kenya. In 1943, he reported that a highly, quote, skilled examination of a series of 100 normal brains of normal natives had found naked eye and microscopic facts indicative of inherent new brain inferiority. Jesus Christ, end quote. These statements show the satisfaction Gordon felt in his technique, research, design, and conclusions. A new research technology was used to simply confirm the old myths. Gordon went so far as to qualify the degree of inferiority, more specifically the, quote, naked eye and the microscopic evidence of the presumed inferiority was this. Qualitatively, the inferiority amounts to 14.8%. Qualitatively, the cells of the brain compared with those of the average normal European shows defect and deficiency. Shut the fuck up, end quote. The conclusions of Carothers, I can't say her name, were equally outrageous. Carothers, born and brought up in South Africa, served 9 years as a medical officer for the British colonial government in Kenya, and was a psychiatrist in charge of the Martharia mental hospital the following 12 years. His long-term service in Africa, his position in a colonial establishment, and his South African origins combined to make him the foremost authority on the, quote, African mind and health and disease, end quote. In his monograph bearing precisely that presumptuous title and sponsored by the World Health Organization. Yeah, they suck. Carothers characterized the adult African as a child with a high emotional lability and marked inability to grow into adulthood. He described the African as incapable of learning from experience and rigidly stereotypical in his behavior. 2 years later, Carothers, that dickhead, was even more specific. He claimed that the African is not only unable to integrate his experience, but he is also, quote, remarkably like the lobotomized Western European and in some ways like the traditional psychos. I'm not saying the rest. It was such crude racism presented as science that shook Fanon's confidence that reason can triumph against the daily abuse of colonial administrators. He found that all sorts of, quote, scientific evidence was collected to embolden and vindicate the colonial predator. Fanon disgust was profound. Oh, Fanon's disgust was profound. Okay, here it is. The first chapter of the history that the others have compiled for me, the foundation of cannibalism, has been made eminently plain in order that I may not lose sight of it. My chromosomes were supposed to have a few thicker and thinner genes presenting cannibalism. In addition to the sex linked, the scholars had now discovered the racial link. What a shame science. What a shameful science. Fanon later analyzed the various tactics scientific racism adopted in different eras. He found that the blatant negation of the black man's humanity gradually took on more subtle and refined repression. First, there was the assertion that culture is totally non-existent among certain groups of people. Then the conditions changed. A hierarchy of culture was propounded, and African cultures were placed at the bottom of the scale. Later, the notion of cultural relativity or relativity gained currency to meet new historical requirements. Each claim, according to Fanon, corresponds to a social historical moment of oppression. The conceptual obliteration of African culture had meaning only when the socioeconomic domination of Africa was total and ruthless. Gordon and Carruthers contentions regarding the absence of cortical integration in the African was hence nothing but a atomical psychological counterpart of the same indictments by the colonial administration. Gut racism maintained by Dent, arms of missionaries preaching equally, found further props in scientific racism. As the notion of cultural relativity emerged, one observes a more subtle reassertions of old convictions. This is so because European civilization is totally permeated with racism. Thus, according to Fanon, the vulgar, primitive, simple racism purported to find in biology, the scripture having proved insufficient, the material base of the doctrine, and it would be too tedious to recall the efforts then undertaken, the comparative form of the skull, the quantity and configuration of the folds of the brain, the characteristics of the cell layers and of the cortex. Such affirmations, crude and massive, give way to more refined arguments. Here and there, however, an occasional relapse is to be noted. This racism that inspires to the rational individual, genotypically and phenotypically determined, become transformed into cultural racism. Yeah, I like that. Fanon's just the best. Yet nowhere was Fanon critiquing the colonial psychological research as strong as in his detailed rebuttal of Mononi's thesis of dependency complexities. The whole chapter of Black Skin's White Mask, quote, the so-called dependency complex of colonized people, end quote, dealt with this. The chapter is significant for at least three reasons. Mononi was a prominent French psychoanalyst whose view could hardly be taken lightly. His analysis of African psychology was also more sophisticated than previous interpretations of the colonial situation. More significantly, Mononi's work had come to public attention at a crucial point in the burgeoning anti-colonial struggle in Africa. In 1964, after Fanon's death, Mononi himself stated that his book had willy-nilly served colonial design. The administrators, military officers, and even missionaries who dealt with particular practical problems of colonial life adopted the book in order to exploit it and extract from the methods and gimmicks to use in pursuit of their own ends. Thus, Fanon carefully and reasoned critique of Mononi's dependency complex theory was indeed timely. Mononi called his book, I can't say this word, Prospero Caliban, The Psychology of Colonization. The author stated that the book was inspired by the desire to comprehend certain elusive features of the colonial situation. Traditional ethnographers and economists had hitherto one-sidedly focused on the trait of colonized people or used abstract concepts devoid of human content. Mononi set out to unravel the psychological coordinates of colonialism. This necessitated the study of the psychological coordinates of colonialism. This necessitated the studies of the psychodynamics of both the colonizer and the colonized. He used cultural myths, folklores, personal conflicts, dreams, and observed behaviors in his analysis. The colonial experience in Madagascar was used in an effort to isolate the psychology of both the colonizer and the colonized. The subsequent analysis, undoubtedly original in approach, had also given scientific trappings to the common vagaries of colonial racism. Colonial racism, Benoni argues, is only the work of petty officials, not the work of the best representatives of the European civilization. In his view, France was the least racist country in the world. The colonial situation, Benoni further asserted, was a condition of mutual misunderstanding and incomprehension. It is the meeting of two distinct personalities of a different culture adaptations. But behind this apparent and shared misunderstanding, Benoni found a complementarity that, in his view, was unconscious and most fundamental. The European, quote, inferior complex led to the need to dominate and paternalize. The African, in turn, suffers from the dependency complex, which leads to the need for the nurturant authority to rule and protect him. This dependency complex was assumed to predate the arrival of the Europeans. Oh my God. An arrival that, in Benoni's view, was long awaited by Africans. So they're saying that Africans were waiting to be enslaved because that's their goal. That's their historical role in the civilization of the world. What a bunch of asses. All right. Real quick. Can everybody remember 108? Because I got to look ahead. Add a bookmark. 108. Here we go. Doo-doo-doo. Okay, cool. We're almost done. 108. We'll stop soon. Okay. The African dependency complex, he argued, was found at a happy gentrification and colonial domination, whereas failure to meet this dependency complex was said to leave the Malagasy with consuming anxieties of, quote, abandonment. Moreover, the Malagasy were seen as prenatal children. Benoni argued that the Malagasy is particular and the African in general are obviously totally unfit to befriend states and absolutely never, clumsily or in any other way, try to grow up as we do. Oh my gosh, end quote. Even his attempt at liberation from French colonialism, in particular, one abortive rebellion during the late 40s, was explained as an ineffectual effort to resolve infantile conflicts. Indeed, using psychoanalytic language, and the conclusion was drawn that the Malagasy lacked the, quote, honor of living out their Oedipus complex. Oh my gosh. And I think this is Benoni. Everybody, this is Benoni. This is all racist shit. The psychological sequence in the Malagasy rebel was probably this. The father image was protected into a Vasaha, the European. They were attacking. The rifle symbolizes the male sex organ. In order to be able to attack the father, in persons of the Vasahi, the Malagasy rebel had persuaded himself that the father, too, was only a harmless child. Thus, instead of protesting, like the European, that he is man-like his father, the Malagasy appears to claim that all men are children. He protects his own dependency on everyone else's. That's disgusting. Calmly and with incredible potent politeness, Fanon exposes Benoni's psychological reductionism and racism. Colonial racism, Fanon argues, is not merely the work of petty officials, nor is France the least racist country in the world, as Benoni had claimed. Racism has an economic, structural, and cultural foundation in European societies. A given society is either racist or it is not. But once racist, none of its members, most of all its best representatives, remains unaffected. Indeed, whether racist or not, even citizens of a racist society is responsible for the crimes committed in the name of his nation. Fanon thus argued that scapegoating petty officials is an invasion of the responsibility of the European bourgeoisie for colonial racism. What is more, to claim that one form of racism is better than the other. Another is simply to deny the essential character of racism. Quote, is there any truth in any differences between one racism and another? do all of them show the same collapse, the same bankruptcy of man? Most disturbing to Fanon was Benoni's proposal of a dependency complex, the psychological reductionism underlining his analysis. This colonialist before him, Benoni, had simply misconstrued the traditional hospitality of the African. For instance, shipwrecked Europeans were welcomed with open arms. Earlier visitors were called, quote, honorable strangers. But this was not appreciated as a gesture of goodwill and of courtesy. Colonialists took unfair advantage of this hospitality. Benoni also used it to elaborate a theory blaming the victim of colonialism. Benoni thus misunderstood the true nature of colonial situations. He had set out to explain. Contrary to his claim, colonialism was by no means a coalescing and pre-existing complexity into a complementary whole. First and foremost, colonialism entails economic and cultural subjugation, motivated by greed and brought about by dint and superior arms. Colonialism also accords reciprocal influence and cultural authenticity. Its hallmark is the disruption and the basic structure of the life of the oppressed. Because of it, the indigenous culture and economy are dislocated. The psychological patterns of oppressed are thus disrupted. Colonialism is therefore neither a harmonizing force nor a phenomenon allowing the simple grafting of its elements into what already exists. Once the native submitted his cases to exist as a independent, self-defining entity, he becomes defined and then defines himself only in relation to his oppressor. Thus, the dependency complex Benoni categorically attributes to the traditional Malagasy. The inferior complex he detected among the Malagasys are only the product and not the antecedents of colonialism. They're the product of it. Benoni had simply confused the case for what actually has been the effect. Fanon was also critical of Benoni's analysis of 7 Malagasy dreams. Without empirical grounds, Benoni assumed these 7 dreams to be, quote, typical of dreams of 1,000 Malagasys. He interpreted all 7 dreams in psychoanalytic and intrapsychic terms. Intrapsychic terms. All the while invoking his theories of abandonment and dependency complex. Moreover, Benoni assumed the universality of European symbolism and unconscious meaning. The tree was said to stand for the mother, the bull for the father, rifle and bull horns for the father's penis. The 7 dreams were then interpreted to indicate epithetical conflicts, pointing to fundamental insecurities in Malagasy psychology. Fanon objected to this global ahistorical interpretation of symbols. He argued that one must place dreams into their proper social historical time and place in order to reveal their true meanings. Fanon was convinced that psychoanalytic theory itself was inadequate to explain the colonial situation. For to grasp the actual import of the Malagasy encounter with colonialism, Fanon argued, quote, the discoveries of Freud are of no use to us here. The Oedipus complex. In particular, Benoni's application of the Oedipus complex in primal sense hypotheses to the colonial situation is most inappropriate. The nightmares of Benoni analyzed were but dream eruptions of lived experience under the torturous realities of colonialism. The black bull does not represent the phallus, P-H-A-L-L-U-S, as Benoni claimed, but the Senegalese colonial soldiers, nor does the rifle of this colonial soldier represent a penis. The rifle has more deadly reality. It is nothing but a genuine rifle, model label, 1916. In short, Monones used psychological reductionism to degenerate the Malagasy. In the end, he justified colonial subjugation and abstracted to a mere symbol of deadly effects of actual guns. And we'll stop there where it says Fanon and colonial medicine. And that is on, hold on, the page 109.
So that was an interesting read. I think white people are really racist. I think Fanon was working against a lot of racism to get this figured out.
Yeah. I think Fanon was actually bringing in a materialist look and seeing how these things interact with these people, with colonial structures and colonial states, and how they interact with non-white people. And Fanon's trying to take that pseudoscience that's just based in idealism, and he's trying to flip it to where we need to consider the conditions, the reality that interacts with the individual and stuff like that. So Fanon's trying to take a materialist outlook of this and reject the science of racism and the science of idealism, it seems like. So he's really trying to do a material psychoanalysis, it seems like. Or yeah. So Fanon based, all the rest of these fuckers, they just wanted to, I mean, the whole fact that they thought that they were just waiting for us to come here is, oh my God, it's a bunch of shit. So, does anybody else have anything to say? Probably not. Not a lot of us here. All right, well, I enjoy this read and I get a lot out of it, and I'm getting more out of it than I read last time, because I think I understand like Fanon's analysis and this person's analysis too, and trying to bring out the strict contradictions within psychology, and utilizing like phrenology, utilizing like race science, pseudoscience in order to engage and to give justification to the white race, and to universalize just the white race as that is the concrete answer, you know, is wild, you know. I didn't realize that last time I read this book, but now I see it. It's one of my main things. But anyways, no, that's all I have to say. Unless anybody else wants to say anything, but it doesn't look like it. All right, everybody.
Goodbye.
I appreciate your readings. Thank you for everything. Talk to you later.